The mountain wind howled through the pines as Charles Turner stood frozen in his cabin doorway, his weathered hands gripping the wooden frame until his knuckles turned white. Before him stood the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes upon, her auburn hair catching the golden light of the setting sun, her emerald eyes blazing with a fierce determination that made his chest tighten with an emotion he had long forgotten existed. This was not the plain, practical bride he had expected from the matrimonial correspondence. This was Emma Murphy, and she was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, and about the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart in these unforgiving mountains. The story had begun 3 months earlier, when Charles Turner sat hunched over his rough-hewn table in the dim light of his oil lamp, struggling to form the words that might bring him a companion to share the brutal isolation of his mountain existence. At 35, he had spent the last decade carving out a life from the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Rockies, his hands scarred from axe work and his face weathered by countless storms. The loneliness had become a constant companion, as familiar as the ache in his bones after a long day of splitting wood or hunting game through the dense forest that surrounded his modest cabin. He had never been a man of many words, and the task of writing to the matrimonial agency felt as daunting as facing down a mountain lion with nothing but his bare hands. What could he offer a woman except hard work, simple meals, and the stark beauty of a life lived far from civilization? His letter had been honest to a fault, describing himself as a plain man seeking a plain wife, someone who understood that survival in the mountains required strength of character rather than beauty, practicality rather than romance. Charles had specified in his correspondence that he sought a woman of sturdy constitution and modest appearance, someone who would not expect luxuries or entertainment beyond what the wilderness could provide. He had painted a picture of their life together in stark terms: the endless cycle of chopping wood, tending to their small garden during the brief growing season, preserving food for the long winters, and finding comfort in each other's company during the months when snow would trap them in their cabin for weeks at a time. The response had come from Emma Murphy, a woman from a small town in Kansas who described herself as experienced in household management and unafraid of hard work. Her letters had been brief and practical, matching his own tone with discussions of preserving techniques, the care of livestock, and her experience helping to run her family's farm after her father's death. She had written that she understood the realities of frontier life and was prepared for the challenges that awaited her in the mountains. What Charles had not expected was the growing warmth that had developed through their correspondence over the following weeks. Emma's letters had revealed glimpses of a sharp wit and a resilience that impressed him. She wrote of her love for the changing seasons, her skill with a rifle, and her ability to find beauty in simple things like the pattern frost made on a window or the way morning light fell across a field of wheat. Slowly, almost against his better judgment, Charles had found himself looking forward to her letters with an anticipation that surprised him. But it was her practical nature that had convinced him she would be a suitable match. She never wrote of romance or passion, never mentioned dreams of a grand wedding or a life filled with social gatherings and fine dresses. Instead, she asked sensible questions about the climate, the availability of supplies, and the nearest neighbors. She seemed to understand that their marriage would be a partnership born of necessity rather than love, a joining of two people who needed each other to survive the harsh realities of mountain life. Charles had sent her money for the journey and detailed instructions for reaching his cabin, warning her that the final stretch would require traveling by horseback up treacherous mountain trails. He had arranged for her to stay overnight in the small mining town of Cedar Ridge before making the final ascent to his home, giving her one last chance to change her mind before committing to a life that would offer no easy escape. The morning of her expected arrival had found Charles more nervous than he cared to admit. He had spent hours cleaning his cabin, scrubbing the rough wooden floors until they gleamed, washing his few dishes until they sparkled, and even attempting to tame his unruly dark hair with water from the creek. He had killed a deer the day before and spent the morning preparing a meal that would show her he could provide for them both, even if his cooking skills were limited to the basics of survival. As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself pacing the small confines of his cabin, checking and rechecking the simple preparations he had made. He had cleared space in his single room for her belongings, though he wondered what possessions a practical woman like Emma Murphy might have brought to her new life. He had fashioned a curtain to provide her with some privacy, knowing that the intimacy of sharing such close quarters would be an adjustment for them both. The sound of horses approaching had sent his heart racing, and he had stepped outside to see a small party making their way up the final stretch of the mountain trail. The guide from Cedar Ridge rode in front, leading a pack horse laden with supplies, and behind him rode a figure so unexpected that Charles had to blink several times to convince himself he was not dreaming. Emma Murphy was nothing like the woman he had imagined from her practical letters. She sat her horse with natural grace, her posture straight despite what must have been hours of difficult riding through mountain terrain. Her traveling dress was simple but well made, and even covered with the dust of the trail, she possessed an elegance that seemed to transform the rough landscape around her. Her auburn hair had been pinned back for the journey, but rebellious strands caught the light like spun copper, and when she turned her head to look at him, her green eyes held a depth and intelligence that made his breath catch in his throat. This was the woman who had written to him of preserving vegetables and mending harnesses, who had asked practical questions about winter preparations and the challenges of mountain life. This was the woman who had agreed to marry a man she had never met, to leave behind everything familiar for a life of hardship and isolation. And she was beautiful, so beautiful that Charles felt a moment of panic at the thought that he might not be worthy of such a woman. The guy dismounted first, a grizzled man named Roy Flores, who had been making the journey between Cedar Ridge and the scattered mountain settlements for more than 20 years. He approached Charles with the easy familiarity of someone who had delivered mail-order brides before, though his expression suggested that this particular delivery had been more pleasant than most. "Turner," Roy said, tipping his hat, "brought your lady up safe and sound, though I got to say, you didn't mention she was such a looker. Had half the men in Cedar Ridge asking if she was spoken for." He chuckled at Charles's expression. "Don't worry, I set them straight. Told them she was already promised to the mountain man, who could probably break any one of them in half without working up a sweat." Emma had dismounted while Roy was speaking, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of years of experience with horses. She approached Charles slowly, her green eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through to his soul. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her. Despite the long journey, she extended her hand in a gesture that was both formal and somehow intimate. "Mr. Turner," she said, and her voice was like music, warm and melodious with just a hint of the Kansas plains in her accent. "I am Emma Murphy. I hope the journey has not delayed me too much. The trails were more challenging than I expected." Charles took her offered hand, marveling at how small and soft it felt in his own calloused grip, yet noting the strength in her fingers that spoke of a woman accustomed to work. "Miss Murphy," he managed, his voice rougher than usual, "welcome to your new home. I hope it meets with your approval." She turned to look at his cabin, taking in the solid log construction, the neat stack of firewood, the small garden plot where he grew what vegetables the short mountain growing season would allow. Her gaze lingered on the spectacular view beyond, where the mountains rolled away into the distance like waves frozen in stone, their peaks catching the late afternoon light in shades of gold and purple. "It's beautiful," she said simply, and something in her tone convinced him that she meant it. "More beautiful than I imagined from your letters. You described it as harsh and unforgiving, but you failed to mention how magnificent it could be." Roy cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "Well, I'll be getting these supplies unloaded and then heading back down the mountain before dark. You folks have some talking to do, I expect." He began untying the packs from the horses, setting Emma's modest collection of belongings on the ground near the cabin door. As Roy worked, Charles found himself stealing glances at Emma, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the practical correspondent who had written to him of her willingness to share a simple life in the wilderness. She moved with purpose as she surveyed her new surroundings, her expression thoughtful rather than dismayed by the isolation that surrounded them. "The nearest neighbors are the Carters, about 5 miles down the valley," Charles found himself saying, falling back on the practical information he had planned to share with her. Scott Lee runs a small ranch another 10 miles beyond that. There's a trading post at Cedar Ridge where we can get supplies we can't make or grow ourselves, but it's a hard day's ride in good weather. Emma nodded, her attention focused on his words with an intensity that surprised him. And in winter, she asked, how long are we typically isolated? Sometimes 3 months or more, Charles admitted. The snows can be fierce, and the trails become impassable. We have to be prepared to be completely self-sufficient from the first heavy snowfall until the spring thaw. Rather than looking dismayed by this information, Emma seemed almost pleased. Good, she said. I was hoping for a life away from the complications of town society. I've had enough of neighbors who think they know what's best for everyone else. There was something in her tone that suggested painful experience, and Charles found himself wondering what had driven a woman like Emma Murphy to seek a new life in the mountains. Her letters had mentioned her father's death and the need to leave Kansas, but they had not revealed the deeper reasons that might compel such a beautiful woman to choose isolation over the admiration she would certainly receive in any civilized community. Roy finished unloading the supplies and approached them. Leading the horses, he would ride back down the mountain. Well, Turner, I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Miss Murphy, it's been a pleasure traveling with you. You've got more grit than most folks who make this journey. He tipped his hat to Emma, then turned to Charles. You're a lucky man, Turner. Don't mess this up. As Roy mounted his horse and began the descent down the mountain trail, Charles and Emma were left alone together for the first time. The silence that fell between them was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with an awareness that their lives had just changed irrevocably. They were married in the eyes of the law, bound together by correspondence and mutual need, but they were still strangers in every way that mattered. Would you like to see inside? Charles asked, gesturing toward the cabin. It's not much, but it's solid and warm. I've tried to make it as comfortable as possible. Emma picked up one of her bags and followed him to the door. As she stepped across the threshold, Charles watched her face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to what would now be her home. The cabin was a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a simple kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and his bed tucked into the far corner. He had hung the curtain he had fashioned to provide her with some privacy, and he had cleared space for her belongings. But there was no disguising the basic, utilitarian nature of their living quarters. Emma set down her bag and walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing over the surfaces Charles had spent hours cleaning and polishing. She examined the neat stack of books on the shelf he had built, paused to look at the simple wooden cross he had carved and hung above the fireplace, and tested the sturdiness of the table where he took his meals and wrote his letters. You built all of this yourself? She asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. Most of it, Charles admitted. The cabin was here when I claimed this land, but it was in poor condition. I've spent years making improvements, adding the kitchen area, building the furniture, making it livable. Emma nodded approvingly. It shows. There's care in every detail. She moved to the window and looked out at the view of the mountains beyond. And this view must be spectacular in all seasons. It is, Charles agreed, though it can be lonely too. The silence takes some getting used to if you're accustomed to town life. Emma turned to face him, and for a moment, the late afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to set her hair on fire. Mr. Turner, I should be honest with you about something. My letters may have given you the impression that I'm a simple farm woman with no experience beyond household duties. That's not entirely true. Charles felt his heart skip a beat. Had he been deceived? Was this beautiful woman about to reveal that she was unsuited for the life she had agreed to share with him? I was educated at a women's academy in Kansas City, Emma continued. I can read and write in French as well as English. I've studied literature and music, and I was considered quite accomplished in what society calls the feminine arts. But I chose to leave that life behind, Mr. Turner. I chose to come here, to you, because I believe there's more value in an honest life built with one's own hands than in all the social graces that civilization prizes. Charles stared at her, trying to process this revelation. Why? He asked finally. Why would a woman with your education and your He gestured helplessly. Your obvious advantages choose to come to a place like this? Emma's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Charles saw a flash of pain in her green eyes. Because I learned that beauty and education and social position mean nothing if you're not free to live according to your own values. I was engaged to be married to a man my family considered suitable, a wealthy merchant who saw me as an ornament to display rather than a partner to respect. When I refused to go through with the marriage, I became a scandal, a woman who had thrown away her chances for a respectable life. She moved away from the window, her hands clasped in front of her as she continued. My father's death left me with few options. I could accept charity from relatives who disapproved of my choices. I could try to find work as a governess or companion to some wealthy family, or I could take control of my own destiny. Your letters spoke of a life where a woman's worth would be measured by her contributions rather than her compliance. That's the life I want, Mr. Turner. That's why I'm here. Charles felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to her words. This was not the simple, practical arrangement he had envisioned. This was a woman who had sacrificed everything familiar and comfortable to seek something authentic, something real. And she had chosen him, chosen this isolated mountain existence as the path to the life she wanted. I should tell you, he said slowly, that I'm not the kind of man who knows how to treat a lady. I've been alone up here for 10 years. My manners are probably rough by civilized standards, and I don't know much about the things that educated women find interesting. Emma smiled, and the expression transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. Mr. Turner, do you think I would have traveled across half the country to marry a man I'd never met if I was looking for civilized conversation and polished manners? I want a partner, not a drawing room companion. I want someone who will respect my mind and my capabilities, not someone who will treat me like a delicate flower that might wilt at the first sign of hardship. As if to emphasize her point, Emma moved to where Roy had left her bags and began unpacking with efficient, practiced movements. Charles watched in fascination as she revealed not the delicate possessions he might have expected from a woman of her background, but practical items that spoke of serious preparation for frontier life. There were sturdy work dresses, leather boots built for hardware, a well-maintained rifle with ammunition, medical supplies, books on agriculture and animal husbandry, and a collection of seeds carefully wrapped and labeled. I spent months preparing for this life, Emma said, noticing his surprise at her possessions. I read everything I could find about mountain living. I learned to shoot and to hunt. I studied preserving techniques and basic veterinary care. I may have been raised as a lady, Mr. Turner, but I'm not helpless. Charles found himself smiling for the first time since her arrival, a genuine expression of pleasure and relief. I can see that, Miss Murphy, though I suppose I should be calling you Emma now, and you should call me Charles. We're going to be sharing close quarters, and formality seems a bit ridiculous under the circumstances. Emma, it is, she agreed, returning his smile. And Charles, though I admit it feels strange to use your given name when we've only just met in person, the mention of their unusual situation brought back the awareness that they were essentially strangers who had agreed to share not just a home, but a life together. Charles felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders, along with a growing awareness of Emma as a woman, rather than simply a solution to his loneliness. As evening approached, Charles found himself moving around the cabin with uncharacteristic nervousness, preparing the simple meal he had planned, while trying not to stare at Emma as she efficiently arranged her belongings in the space he had cleared for her. She moved with a grace that seemed to fill the small cabin with life, her presence transforming the utilitarian space into something that felt, for the first time, like a real home. "Can I help with supper?" Emma asked, approaching the kitchen area where Charles was working over the wood stove. "I'm a decent cook, and I'd like to contribute." "I've got it handled," Charles replied, then immediately regretted the brusque tone. "I mean, you've had a long journey. You should rest." Emma raised an eyebrow at his response. "Charles, if we're going to be partners, you need to let me be useful. I didn't come here to be waited on." He paused in his work, struck by the directness of her response. "You're right, I'm sorry. I suppose I'm not used to having someone else in the kitchen." "Or anywhere else, I imagine," Emma said gently. This must be as much of an adjustment for you as it is for me. Charles nodded, grateful for her understanding. 10 years is a long time to live alone. I've gotten set in my ways. Emma moved to stand beside him at the stove, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. Then we'll both have to learn new ways, she said. Together. The word together seemed to hang in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. They worked side by side to finish preparing the meal, their movements gradually synchronizing as Emma learned the layout of Charles's kitchen and he adjusted to having another person sharing his space. As they sat down to eat at the simple wooden table, the reality of their situation settled over them both. Here they were, two people who had known each other only through letters, sharing a meal in a cabin that would now be their shared home. The silence that fell was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness and uncertainty. The venison is excellent, Emma said finally. You're a better cook than you claim to be in your letters. Necessity, Charles replied. A man learns to make do when he's cooking for himself. Emma nodded, then looked around the cabin again. How long have you been living here? In this exact spot? I mean? 7 years in this cabin, Charles answered. I spent the first 3 years in a much smaller place down by the creek while I was building this one. This location has better drainage, more protection from the wind, and a clearer view of the approaches to the valley. For security? Emma asked. Charles nodded. Partly. There are still occasional problems with bandits, and wildlife can be dangerous. Bears, mountain lions, wolves in winter. It pays to be able to see trouble coming. Rather than looking alarmed, Emma seemed interested. I brought my rifle, as I mentioned. I'm a fair shot, though I've never had to use it for protection against anything more dangerous than coyotes threatening our chickens back home. Hopefully you won't need to hear either, Charles said, but it's good to know you can handle yourself. Life up here can be unpredictable. They continued eating in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the dramatic change their lives had just undergone. Charles found himself stealing glances at Emma, still hardly able to believe that this beautiful, accomplished woman was now his wife, that she had chosen this isolated life with him over whatever options had been available to her in civilization. After they finished eating, Emma insisted on helping with the cleanup, and Charles found himself oddly pleased by the domestic scene they created together. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing these simple tasks, about the easy way Emma adapted to his kitchen and his routines. As full darkness settled over the mountains, bringing with it the profound quiet that Charles had grown accustomed to over the years, he realized that Emma was experiencing this wilderness silence for the first time. He watched her face as she stood by the window, listening to the subtle sounds of the mountain night, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through the pines, the far-off howl of a coyote. It's so quiet, she said softly. I can actually hear my own heartbeat. Does it bother you? Charles asked, moving to stand beside her at the window. Emma considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. It's peaceful. In Kansas City, there was always noise, always activity, people and carriages and commerce. Here, it feels like the world has slowed down to a more natural pace. Charles felt a surge of relief at her words. He had been worried that the isolation might prove too much for a woman accustomed to society, but Emma seemed to be embracing the solitude rather than fighting it. As the evening progressed, they found themselves talking more easily, sharing stories about their past lives and their hopes for the future. Emma spoke of her love of reading and her fascination with the natural world, while Charles found himself opening up about his reasons for choosing this isolated life, his love of the mountains and his satisfaction in building something with his own hands. What made you choose this particular spot? Emma asked as they sat before the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The view, partly, Charles admitted, but also the practical considerations. Good water source, protection from the worst weather, soil that can support a garden, plenty of timber for building and fuel, and the isolation. I wanted to be far enough from civilization that I could live according to my own rules. What rules are those? Emma asked, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. Charles considered the question. Honesty, hard work, self-reliance, treating the land with respect. not depending on others for what I can provide for myself. Emma nodded thoughtfully. Those are good rules. They're part of why I was drawn to your letters. You wrote about a life based on real values rather than social expectations. As the fire began to burn lower, the question of sleeping arrangements became impossible to ignore. Charles had planned to give Emma the bed and sleep on the floor, but he found himself uncertain about how to broach the subject. They were married, legally bound together, but they were still strangers in every meaningful way. Emma seemed to sense his dilemma. Charles, she said gently, I know this situation is unusual for both of us. We're married, but we don't really know each other yet. I think we should take things slowly. Give ourselves time to become comfortable with each other before we worry about the more intimate aspects of marriage. Charles felt a rush of gratitude for her directness and understanding. I was hoping you'd feel that way, he admitted. I want this to work between us, Emma, but I want it to be right. Emma smiled, and the expression was warm and genuine. I want it to work too, and I believe it will, given time. We chose each other for good reasons, even if we didn't know everything about what we were choosing. That night, Charles slept on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, while Emma took his bed behind the curtain he had hung for her privacy. As he lay listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain night, now made somehow different by Emma's presence, Charles found himself filled with a cautious optimism about the future they might build together. The woman who had arrived that day was nothing like what he had expected, but she was everything he hadn't dared to hope for. Beautiful, intelligent, strong-willed, and brave enough to risk everything for the chance at an authentic life. As sleep finally claimed him, Charles Turner allowed himself to believe that perhaps, against all odds, he might have found not just a partner for survival, but a woman he could truly love.